This is The Other Side of Midnight with Frank Morano.
They're running a strange program, y'all.
Now, here's Frank Morano.
Well, the bad news is that 1/5 of the world is apparently lonely. The good news is the other 4/5 of you have me. That's right. I am what's keeping you company at night or in the morning or whenever you happen to listen to this show. I am here for you, and so is the venerable and incredible Dominic Carter, who we try to start each and every program with. He's a veteran broadcast journalist and a nationally syndicated radio talk show host. Hello there, Dominic.
It's nice to be with you, Frank, Mr. 4-4, as always.
Thank you, my friend. All right, I got to run this by you. You know Mike Bloomberg a long time. I remember, I think his first television interview as a mayoral candidate was with you about 23 years ago. You may even go back farther than that. And you've moderated debates that he's been in. You've covered him as a presidential candidate, as a mayor, as a mayoral candidate, you name it. And in fact, one of the first times I was ever on television with you was when I was talking about Mike Bloomberg's prospective presidential campaign as an independent. Well, Mike Bloomberg is also one of the most generous philanthropists in the world. And starting in the fall semester, paying tuition is going to be one less thing to worry about for most medical students at Johns Hopkins University. And apparently Mike Bloomberg's philanthropic organization, which donated $1 billion to cover tuition for students who come from households earning less than $300,000. So additionally, students from families who bring in less than $175,000 will also have their fees and living expenses covered. So if you earn less than 300 grand, or your family does, and you go to Johns Hopkins, thanks to Mike Bloomberg, the tuition is going to be free. Give me your reaction to this, Dominic. What do you make of this?
Doesn't surprise me at all. That's Mike Bloomberg. If you get to know him, a couple of things come to mind. So I recall several years. First of all, you offended me, Frank. You said it was 24 years ago that I interviewed Bloomberg. Are you calling me an old man?
Must have been some other guy.
I'm only joking. But to go to Johns Hopkins, and it's pronounced Johns Hopkins, correct?
That's my understanding. I never went there, but yes, Johns Hopkins.
Okay, so yeah. I went there with Bloomberg when he went back to be the graduation speaker. And it's right, I believe the campus, if I remember correctly, it's in Baltimore, right outside Baltimore. But Frank, it is one of the most beautiful campuses that I've ever seen in my life. Everywhere you walk around, it says the Bloomberg School of this, the Bloomberg School of that. The grounds are kept in a way that I've ever seen any. It's almost like a botanical gardens when you're walking around the campus. And I don't know if they're still known for this, but the university, they were known for their lacrosse team. They used to win national championships, often beating my alma mater, Syracuse University, in men's lacrosse. So to know Mike Bloomberg, before he became mayor, and he came out of nowhere, political novice, decides to run for mayor. The establishment said he couldn't win, mayor of New York City. Boom, he wins. You have 9/11, you have the Democrats squabbling with each other. Bloomberg comes in. He embraces the city's first black mayor. He spends a ton of money, as you know, and I mean a ton of money in record numbers, and he's elected. Now, the reason why this is important to because you have to understand the Bloomberg story. So when he came in, I think he was worth $4 billion. When he left mayor, he was worth $20 billion, mayor of New York. I think he's now worth $100 billion.
Wow.
From his companies. And he has no problem with spreading the money around. He to talk to Mike Bloomberg, Frank, he will tell you exactly what's on his mind. So once he took a dig at me, and he was right, an early morning event, and sometimes I could lose a few pounds. And I'm sitting there eating a bagel, and he's the mayor, he's about to give a speech. And he walks past me, right? He kind of hurt. And he goes, Dominic, you really need to put that bagel down. And kept walking to go deliver the speech. But He wasn't being mean. That's Mike Bloomberg. That's just the way he is. And so, he would tell the press corps, and I'm coming back to your topic, he would fly his aircraft to Bermuda, and he wouldn't tell the media where he was going. And, he was a different type of mayor. But it doesn't surprise me at all, the money that they're raising for the medical school. Frankly, that's the way it should be. A couple of schools have done that now. And with the City College of New York, I know that Frank, the city system, back in the 50s and 60s, I believe it was back in that time period, it was free to attend anyway.
The thing that I wonder, though, isn't it kind of a shame that a lot of these great schools, if you want to go there and not be saddled with 25 years worth of student loan debt, you essentially have to rely on the generosity of a billionaire? I'm wondering if maybe our higher educational institutions, the economics of attending them, have gotten a little out of control.
They're way out of control. But when you look at faculty costs, the cost of the sports program, the cost this, the cost that, and then what's even more insulting is if you look at the endowments at some of these universities like Harvard, they have so much money, but they're not really giving it back to the students. They're building new buildings on campus. They're expanding. You shouldn't have to rely on a billionaire, but Frank, if so, let's say Carmine, your son, right now, of course, you're well on your way to making a ton of money, right?
Right.
No, I said well on your way, right? So, 15 years from now, Carmine's ready for college. I mean, if a billionaire is putting up the money, wouldn't you want it to be available for Carmine?
Well, certainly, right, certainly. But, I'm not counting on that, so we're scrolling away whatever we can in terms of savings right now. Absolutely.
And that's a good idea. A good idea.
You know what I wonder, Dominic? I mean, you've been to doctors like anybody has. We've seen the incredible amounts of money that specialists can make in the medical field when if you're just a normal primary care physician or an ER doctor or you have a specialty that's maybe not as lucrative, you don't make that kind of money. I'm wondering if this initiative is going to affect the distribution of medical specializations among students. Do you see any sort of an increase in primary care physicians or a shift towards more lucrative specialties because of this? Or will it have no effect on what kind of medicine people study?
It's already had an impact in many states. So, for example, what comes to my mind is New York. And there's a shortage of OBN doctors that deliver babies, GYN for women, and OBN because of the high insurance rates, and that they're sued quite a bit. So it's very expensive. And I know the common thought, Frank, is to say, well, when they graduate from med school, they go on to make a ton of money. Not necessarily true. To the point that you just made, it depends on what the doctor's specialty is. They've got to get through college. They've got to get through 3 years of their residency. Mm-hmm. It's a lot of money. And so a couple of billionaires in their graduation addresses have announced, with the parents sitting there, that from the class going forward, we will pay the full tuition for your child to attend medical school. It's a good thing.
Absolutely.
We need more doctors, and I just think it's wonderful. I really do.
Yeah, no, I do too. Don't get me wrong, and this is very generous. And I wish I could do it. I'd do the same thing. By the way, if people want to comment, you can join the conversation at 646-720-0635, 646-720-0635. Last question, Dominic, because unfortunately everything these days is viewed through something of a racial prism. And a lot of communities of color will not necessarily have the resources to go to a higher educational institution like Johns Hopkins without this. So I'm wondering, How do you think this donation is going to impact the diversity of the student body at Johns Hopkins? Are there specific demographics, specific communities that you think might benefit more than others?
Well, it's funny that you say that, Frank, because, and I wasn't going to go there, but there have been Hollywood movies made about Johns Hopkins history, which wasn't good.
Oh, I know. That's why I asked the question. Yeah.
Right. Which wasn't good in terms of African Americans were allowed to assist, but they weren't allowed to have major roles at the medical school. There have been Hollywood movies done about this. And so you have Bloomberg come along, and I really think that his heart is in the right place. And when you think about the fact that this man is now worth plus $100 billion, this is a drop in the bucket for him. And, he's in his late 70s?
Right. And I think he might even be 82, I think.
Yeah, I believe you're right. And I think this is his way of giving back. I know, for example, that in a lot of his initiatives, he has it not where there are quotas, but he makes sure that there are different racial groups. Generally speaking, I shouldn't say, I like the guy. I like the guy not because of his money. It's just because of who he is. And if you get to know him, he's a good guy. When it comes to billionaires, the person that we work for, Mr. John Catsimatidis, he is the most down-to-earth
that's for sure.
billionaire that I've ever met in my life. Mike Bloomberg is sort of like that, but not as far as Mr. Catsimatidis and Mrs. Catsimatidis are. As you know, Frank, you could sit down with the Catsimatidis and discuss anything, and they'll sit down and discuss it with you.
Oh, no,
like any other regular person.
No doubt about it, and how, that's for sure.
Right, and so Mike Bloomberg, you can't really do that with him.
Last question about this $1 billion donation, because we'd all like to be in the position where we could donate $1 billion to something. If you had $1 billion to donate to the medical field, would you have done this? Would you have chosen to fund tuition? Or do you think there are other areas within healthcare that might benefit more significantly from a donation like this?
If I had money like this, and it's laughable, but if I had money like this, I would probably do it in the field of journalism. I've always wanted to do a memorial scholarship in my mother-in-law's name. And she's deceased now. Her name was Ruby Stevens. And I've always wanted to do, not even with a lot of money, I've always wanted to do it with like maybe $100,000 a year. But obviously I can't afford that right now. I plan on doing it. But we do need people to step up in the medical field because here's the bottom line, Frank. If you've got the smarts to make it through medical school, money shouldn't be the obstacle to stop you.
Exactly. And
the bottom line.
And as you pointed out, it's a shame that these schools that have endowments that are so large that they could fund tuition, it really are still charging these exorbitant tuitions, in my view. All right. We'll end it there. Dominic, I will see you tomorrow, my friend.
Thank you. Have a great show. Don't keep me up all night.
No promises. If you want to comment, you can do so. 646-720-0635. Hey, we're going to talk about the Supreme Court in a minute. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez wants to impeach two of the justices and a couple of senators who are a little bit more serious, I think. They are calling for a special counsel investigation into Clarence Thomas. And what about that presidential immunity ruling that came down last week? I have some questions about it, but we're going to go to the go-to guy when it comes to the Supreme Court. Professor at Pepperdine Law School. I wonder what their tuition situation is. Barry McDonald. He joins us straight ahead.
The Other Side of Midnight with Frank Morano.
Economists warn that massive tax hikes could devastate your IRA and 401k as the stock market braces for impact. I'm Larry Kudlow, and I urge you to fortify your savings with physical gold with my friends at Priority Gold. To learn how gold and silver can help diversify your savings, please call 1-800-405-GOLD or just visit PriorityGold.com to get a free gold information guide. That's 1-800-405-GOLD.
It's The Other Side of Midnight with Frank Morano.
This is The Other Side of Midnight. I'm Frank Morano. Boy, oh boy, is there a lot going on with the Supreme Court, and it's not even in session. Last week's decision by the court on presidential immunity was either no big deal or the most significant court case that we've seen since Bush versus Gore, depending on what experts, what media outlets you turn to. And then yesterday comes around, you have two senators asking the Attorney General to appoint a special counsel to investigate ethical violations by Justice Thomas. And wait, there's more. There's a member of Congress that's actually submitting articles of impeachment for three of the justices. So how do we wrap our heads around what the court is actually doing, where the court's going, how the public perceives the court, the relationship of the court with the rest of the government and with the rest of the country, quite frankly? Well, one of the people that I enjoy turning to in discussing the Supreme Court is Barry McDonald. He's a noted law professor at Pepperdine University, an incredible expertise in constitutional law. And whenever I've read his work in the New York Times or any other publication on the subject of the Supreme Court, I end up agreeing with whatever point he's trying to make, even if I didn't think I was going to agree when I first started reading the article. That's why I'm very grateful that he's agreed to return to the program. Barry McDonald, thanks so much for joining me on The Other Side of Midnight.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Frank.
Let me begin with asking you about this decision on presidential immunity. This is something that has been very divisive in terms of where people view this case and how significant they view the implications of this case. Give me your view on the presidential immunity case. And if people aren't familiar with it, basically the Reader's Digest version is they say the president does have immunity for official acts, but doesn't have it for non-official acts. They don't necessarily define what those official acts are. What was your take on the decision, Barry?
Yeah, I thought it was a bit unnecessary to go as far as the majority did to lay out all these complicated rules about when the president is immune or when the president isn't immune. They actually created three categories that now lower courts are going to have to look at when this comes up. So they said, well, if the president is exercising his core constitutional responsibilities, then he's absolutely immune from any prosecution once he leaves office for violating criminal law. On the other hand, if he's not exercising core constitutional responsibilities, but just sort of performing the everyday job of president, then he's entitled to presumptive immunity unless the government can show that holding the president accountable wouldn't sort of impede the functioning of the executive branch. It's a very sort of loosey-goosey standard. And then, of course, in door three, you have private acts or unofficial acts where the president enjoys no immunity. That just makes sense. You can't just violate the law even if you're the president, if you're just engaged in private conduct. But the big question here is how are lower courts going to sort of sort through all of this and figure it out? And a lot of people say process is substance. And my fear is even though presidents can theoretically still be held accountable for violating criminal law when they're performing official acts, if it lies outside of this core area. I mean, just sorting through, for lower courts to sort through all that, to, sift through the arguments of the prosecution, the defense as to what's what. And a lot of these acts, first of all, you got to decide, is it official or unofficial or private? That's a hard line to draw. Then if it's official, is it core? Is it non-core? I mean, so again, process is substance. I think it's going to be very difficult to hold former presidents accountable for violating criminal law for things they do while they were in office.
I share the same concerns, and I said so at the time of the decision. And one of the things that several listeners pointed out with this decision is, well, look, there have not exactly been a lot of presidents that have been held criminally accountable. And I think there's many violations of the law that you could point to on the part of presidents, Republican and Democrat. So I guess my question on a practical level is, keeping in mind everything that you said, does this actually change anything, or does this actually just codify what had been sort of this traditional gentleman's agreement among presidents of both parties, which is we're not going to prosecute our predecessors?
Well, I wouldn't characterize that as a gentleman's agreement. I mean, the only real sort of analog to what's happening today would be Richard Nixon, in my mind. He, I think, assumed that he could have been criminally prosecuted for the Watergate events because he accepted Gerald Ford's pardon for those events. So I think if there's a tradition in our country, it is that if you haven't done something that's heinous, for example, like you haven't killed somebody, but all you've done is broken into the headquarters of the DNC, the Democratic National Committee. At that point, I think to bring the country back together, future presidents tend to pardon their predecessors, to unify the country. But if it's something that's really serious, I don't think we do have a history or a tradition of how to deal with that. And I think that the sort of huge wall of immunity that the majority has seemingly erected here can be unwise.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I certainly agree. I just had to bring it up because a lot of folks have been asking about it. Now, the other thing that has been pretty significant is the Supreme Court case on bribery, where the court ruled 6-3 that essentially public officials can accept gratuity after they've done whatever official act, even if it looks very much like a bribe. Now, there's a lot of people in New York and New Jersey that are pretty excited about this. New York's former Lieutenant Governor Brian Benjamin is celebrating the fact that this may mean he's not going to get retried for his corruption case. Bob Menendez in New Jersey, he's on trial now for a corruption case, and some folks are saying that this Supreme Court ruling could mean if he's convicted, that case could get thrown out. What's your view on that case and what the ramifications might be for other public officials?
Yeah, well, the court basically said that this federal statute, if you read the text of the statute, it's somewhat ambiguous, but I think a very fair reading of it is that if you, with corrupt intent, accept a reward after the fact for having performed an official act, that is a form of corruption that can be prosecuted. And I think the dissent in that case spelled out that case very well. Now, it's not to say that conservatives in the majority were sort of out to lunch in the way they read the statute. But what I see is sort of a troubling trend over the last few terms of the court on the part of the conservative majority to read public corruption statutes very strictly, which have ended up making prosecutions of public officials in situations where it's pretty clear that they were acting corruptly, making it very difficult. And I think that this recent Snyder opinion is the one you're talking about, is sort of right in that trend. And I don't know why the conservatives are so concerned with reading these public corruption statutes extremely strictly. I mean, I get it that you don't want somebody criminally accused and convicted unless they have pretty fair notice of what they do is right or wrong. But, in my view, for example, in this case that you're talking about, the mayor, I believe it was in Indiana, the facts were pretty clearly showing that he was being rewarded for having steered a lot of contracts to a private contractor.
So, I mean, the lesson is, if you're a public official now and you want to engage in a corrupt bargain with a developer or some sort of a special interest, just have them give you the gold bars or the campaign contribution or the cash afterward, right?
I mean, yeah, that's the reading that they took of this particular statute. That's not to say that there couldn't be other federal corruption laws that might come into play, but this particular law has been denuded in terms of, holding people responsible for accepting gratuities after the fact. And again, I think you could have gone either way on reading the statute here. Why you would sort of side against public corruption, I just don't know.
All right. You wrote a column which I absolutely loved about 6 years ago, asking the question in the New York Times, should the Supreme Court matter so much? And there's no doubt, wherever people fall on the political spectrum, left wing, right wing, or somewhere in between, the Supreme Court matters more than ever. Every time there's a vacancy on the court, both sides get ready to fight a war. They raise boatloads of money to support or oppose a potential nominee, and a lot of rank and file Americans that are concerned about issues like gun laws, abortion, whatever, they make their choice for president based on the Supreme Court. Why did you raise that question? Should the Supreme Court matter so much? And can you answer that question for us? Where do you come down on the question of whether the Supreme Court should matter?
Where I come down is it shouldn't matter, at least if you took sort of the founders' view of the Supreme Court's role in our society. The founders gave the Supreme Court independent, lifetime tenure in order to sort of insulate them from political considerations so that they could impartially and fairly interpret and apply the law. And so to act as that umpire, calling balls and strikes that Supreme Court justices cynically talk about when in their confirmation hearings, but don't adhere to when it gets to once they get on the court. And so the founders thought that judges in a democracy who are appointed and serve for lifetime shouldn't really have any say in policymaking in a democracy. That should be the job of the people's representatives. That should be the job of the Congress. That should be the job of the president. But in terms of judges who are unaccountable to the people, that enjoy lifetime tenure, they need to stay in their lane and narrowly decide legal disputes. Well, that whole scheme has gone topsy-turvy in our modern era, where the Supreme Court regularly decides massive questions of public policy, depending upon who has 5 votes at the time on the court. And they are not accountable to the people for these decisions that should be left with the people's representatives. And so, my answer is the Supreme Court, if it were operating the way that the founders envisioned, who sits on the court wouldn't matter so much, as long as they were sort of impartially applying law to resolve a case as it comes before them. But today they act as sort of these big policymakers. They enjoy sort of wielding that power. And it's just, they claim, at least today, the conservatives claim to be originalists. But if they really sort of took a historical view or interpretation of the Supreme Court's role in our constitutional system, it would look a lot different than the way they are acting these days.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because as far as I'm concerned, that's exactly my view, is that the people making policy should be the people that we vote for, not judges. And, I think I'm glad you mentioned the confirmation hearings, because I think it's the most buffoonish act of nonsense in the world, where you have these incredibly brilliant people, the nominees, who have opinions on everything, who've spent the last 40 years of their life forming those opinions, going before Congress, and then pretending they don't have opinions on anything. And it's a ridiculous process. So let me ask you then, and if people are just tuning in, we're talking with Barry McDonald, law professor at Pepperdine University and an expert in constitutional law. How would we reform the Supreme Court to get it back to the role that a lot of the founders thought that it would play in American life?
Well, there are a million sort of suggestions that have been written about out there, how we can reform the Supreme Court so that it sort of goes back to its original lane in our constitutional system. So there are a lot of sort of different ways you could approach this. I think the easiest start would be to just increase the size of the court from 9 justices to, say, 15, 18. You pick a number. I think the more justices you get on the court, the better decision-making occurs and the less chance of sort of forming these voting blocks along partisan or ideological lines. It reduces. But so that's just a minor sort of fix, but it's the easiest one. I think we need to put term limits on justices. There's a big debate about whether that would require a constitutional amendment or not. My own view is that the court has interpreted other provisions of the Constitution very broadly, and in the same way, the provisions that govern the tenure of Supreme Court justices could be interpreted so that, you could place term limits on the Supreme Court without a constitutional amendment. Another good housekeeping rule that I think Congress has the constitutional authority to impose, if it had the political will to do it, is to say that the court will not hold a law unconstitutional unless you get a supermajority vote of the court to do that. So, again, there are just plenty of sort of fixes, adjustments to the court that have been proposed. The problem is that all of them require congressional action. That's not going to happen anytime soon because when the court favors the Republicans, they are opposed to any sort of court reform. When court decision-making seems to favor the Democrats, now they're opposed to any sort of reform efforts. And so we just sort of trudge along in this very unsatisfying position. So my own view is that all these sort of structural fixes may help solve the problem, but the real problem is our judicial culture in America. So I had the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada visiting my class years ago, and I said, do you have the same problem on the Canadian Supreme Court that we do in terms of partisan voting blocks? And she said, no, in Canada, she said somewhat, but it's really not a big issue because judges are just expected to be impartial and nonpartisan. And if you act in a way contrary to that, you are frowned on. You are disapproved of. In our country, you have these audiences that are really sort of voting, applauding for their justice to go off in a extreme right or extreme left position. And it's just, it's the judicial culture. And so I think the one fix that I think we need a president who's going to come along, flag this problem and say, okay, I'm a Democrat, I'm a Republican, yes, but I'm going to start appointing justices not based on their ideological views, not based on their party affiliation, but based on a consensus of experts that they are sort of a great legal mind, that they have a great judicial temperament, that they are going to approach cases in a fair-minded, impartial way. I think it's going to take the president who nominates these people to sort of start to change the way we think about judges in our society.
And that would be delightful. And to me, it makes no difference whether it's a Democrat or a Republican doing that, because, when the conservatives used to rail against left-wing judicial activism, whether it was on abortion or gay rights or anything like that, I thought they were exactly right. But now that it's the conservatives that are in the majority and they're exercising their own form of judicial activism on issue after issue, I find it equally objectionable because I, as a voter, want to be electing the people that make those decisions. I'd love to see some sort of judicial culture change. And unfortunately, I'm not optimistic about it anytime soon, but maybe the frustration that everyone seems to be having with many different aspects of the court will change that. All right, let me ask you about the latest news. Senators Sheldon Whitehouse and Ron Wyden have asked the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, to appoint a special counsel to investigate potential ethical or legal violations by Justice Thomas. What's your read on what Justice Thomas has engaged in? Does this cross the line of being unethical? Does it cross the line? They seem to certainly think there's a chance of being illegal. Or is this just kind of one partisan political branch of government going after another partisan political branch of government?
Well, I mean, if you read ProPublica's reporting, that part of the problem is we just have sort of media reports, but we don't have a complete and thorough factual investigation. But if the allegations are correct, I think that there's a huge problem. I mean, the allegations are that essentially that Justice Thomas accepted all these perks and gratuities and benefits from billionaire conservative donors and didn't report them and only reported them after it became public that this had happened. And I don't think it takes a rocket scientist to say that there's a problem there, especially when, you know, the federal law and judicial oaths require justices to decide cases in an impartial way. And even if their appearance of them being impartial is questioned, federal law requires them to recuse from a particular case. And so I just think we've really lost something in the federal judiciary, and particularly at the level of the Supreme Court, in terms of how a judge is expected to conduct themselves in office.
By the way, just so people know where you're coming from, and it makes no difference to me regardless. When I read your writing, I can't tell if you're someone that would be considered conservative or liberal, but some of the audience may take some of what you say differently depending on whatever perceived political biases that you have. Do you have any sort of political bent that you're open about?
Oh, I'm a registered independent. I don't have a liberal or conservative leaning. I tell my constitutional law classes all the time that's not who I am. My job is to sort of teach the students how to think about these particular issues. So when the liberals used to control the Supreme Court, and I thought that they were doing something out, that was illegitimate, I would call them out. I'm doing the same thing now with the conservatives now that they're controlling the court. So really, it's just who is steering the court, and are they steering it in the proper way?
Makes sense. Finally, sir, I'll ask you about Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez filing articles of impeachment against Justices Alito, Thomas, and claiming that there is just unchecked corruption with the two of them. What's your take on this? This has got to be just politics, right? You don't see any substantive merit to what she's saying.
Well, I mean, as far as Justice Alito, the only thing I'm aware of is, the flag flying incident and him making some conservative remarks to reporters that were perhaps inappropriate. So I don't know what any basis for that is in terms of articles of impeachment. Justice Thomas, again, we haven't had a thorough investigation of what was going on behind the scenes with a lot of these billionaire conservative donors and whether any acts could be said to violate federal or state law. We just don't know. But if indeed an investigation turns out that even a justice committed a serious crime, I think that they should be impeachable for that. But I'm not saying that Justice Thomas did that. I'm just saying that because of all the confidentiality that surrounds the court and what justices do and their reporting, that we just don't know. All we get are sort of tidbits here and there of what might have happened.
As far as the precedent for impeachment of a Supreme Court justice, am I correct in thinking that the only Supreme Court justice that was impeached was Samuel Chase back in 1805, and that he was acquitted in the Senate? Has there been anybody else that was ever impeached?
I would have to check, but I know that Justice Abe Fortas, there was some talk about it in connection with some alleged corruption that he had engaged in the late 1960s, but he resigned before that went anywhere. Justice Chase, back in the early 1800s, that was a situation where on a lower court, he had engaged in a lot of sort of partisan diatribes against one of the other parties. And they also, I think I'm thinking about the right justice, but they, out of that situation where they failed to impeach him, sort of arose the tradition or custom that you can't impeach a Supreme Court justice just because of the way they decide cases, whether you think that they're conservative, liberal, et cetera. So, and I think that that's a sound sort of custom and tradition. The impeachment mechanism has its most common application to federal judges on the district court level who have engaged in illegal conduct. I don't think that if it's proven that a Supreme Court justice has engaged in illegal conduct, that they should be treated any differently from a federal district judge.
Sure. I think in the case of Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, and I agree that Justice Thomas may have crossed an ethical line or two here, but I think to bring articles of impeachment against Alito and Thomas, to me, it just looks blatantly political. Professor Barry McDonald, I always enjoy our conversations. Thank you for taking the time. I hope we can talk again soon.
Yeah, and I want to just say that I agree with you in terms of Justice Thomas. It is premature at this point. It seems very political. We just need to, we need to do an investigation outside of the politics and get to what really happened.
Sure. Barry McDonald, Pepperdine University. If you want to comment on any portion of our conversation, please feel free to do so. You can give me a call at 646-720-0635. That is 646-720-0635. This is The Other Side of Midnight. I'm Frank Morano. Straight ahead.
The Other Side of Midnight. It's The Other Side of Midnight with Frank Morano.
Singing Oh What a Night. This is a birthday bumper music selection from our friend Tom Brodo. Tom Brodo is an interesting guy. He's started off as a listener, but he's been listening to me for years. He's been a listener of the week before. And really, we've become friends. He participated in the ping pong tournament the last 2 years. Great guy. Gave me this wonderful bottle of bourbon. Also a really interesting book about General Sherman, which is in my stack. Just incredibly generous with both Rachel and me, he and his sweetheart, Janice. He's been a listener of the week before. He's participated in the $1,000 Minute before. He's a great guy. But technically yesterday was his birthday, but he said he's celebrating today. So we are giving him a little bit of a birthday bonus. All right, 646-720-0635 if you want to comment on any portion of my discussion with Barry McDonald. Speaking of books, I talked about those books that Tom Brodo gave me. Gary from Staten Island has been leaving increasing numbers of books on my porch or on my property, right? So if you don't know about Gary from Staten Island, I almost envy you. But He's a character, and he happens to live 2 blocks away from me. So 2 weeks ago, he leaves this book for me. He leaves 2 books, one of which I really want to read. And it always makes me nervous when Gary knows exactly the kind of books that I want to read, because look, Gary is a very intelligent guy, as you know from his calls, but he's a few aces short of a full deck, putting it politely. Right, Matt, you'd agree with that? Do you know Gary? Have you met him in person?
I haven't met him in person, but I've spoken to him on the phone several times.
That's you don't even know what you don't know him. Then it's a world of difference between an in-person Gary interaction and one by phone. You know what the big difference is? You can hang up the phone, but you can't get away in person. Anyway, so a week or so ago, or 2 weeks ago maybe, he leaves me 2 interesting books. One I didn't have strong feelings about. The other book I really want to read. And that always makes me nervous because I could see myself ending up where Gary is, you know, going from being a kind of urbane, sophisticated gadfly who comments on public affairs and goes to all the local hearings and testifies to all of a sudden I'm shouting in the middle of the street at anybody who will listen, holding a handmade sign. So at least caused me to rethink my position. But all right, I take the book and I put it in my stack of books, which is ever growing. But I can't figure out why there's some water damage on it, like, which is really annoying when it comes to a book because the pages kind of stick. All right. So then 2 or 3 days later, he leaves me another book, a book that I really want to read. So yesterday or the day before, he leaves, my wife reports to me, a whole bunch of books on the lawn. My wife says they were in abysmal condition. They looked water damaged. They looked filthy. They looked decrepit. She said, I wouldn't be surprised if they have bugs. I'm not bringing them into this house. I just threw them away. And she asked me, she said, those other books that he gave you, including the ones that you liked, you got to throw them away. Because I don't know what's in there. There could be all sorts of weird stuff in there, including bugs. Don't bring them in the house. So it killed me to do it. But yesterday or today, I guess technically, when we're putting out the trash, we put out some of these books, including the ones that I really want to read. So no one should send me any books unless they're really, really good books. But if you do send me a book, please make sure that they're not filthy and disintegrated and look like they have bugs. So that's what we're dealing with. 646-720-0635. Let me begin with Alex. Hey, Alex, what's on your mind?
You're saying that Gary's a bit crazy, and I don't think that's the smartest thing to say unless you know he's 100% harmless. Because the guy lives, you said, 2 blocks away from you, and he knows where you live, and he might be listening right now. So I think you insulted him. And I think you got to be careful, maybe, unless you think the guy wouldn't know how to kill someone or do anything bad to anybody.
Well, I appreciate the advice, Alex. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I also, about that conversation with the professor, I wanted to ask him because he's an expert, but maybe you would know, as it pertains to official acts with this immunity case, because the court said there's a difference between core constitutional responsibilities that the president has with official acts and other official acts. Do you know of any specifics for what would be a core constitutional responsibility and what would just be a official act that has presumptive immunity?
Yeah, I don't. And I didn't read the full opinion. I did read Justice Amy Coney Barrett's concurring opinion. And she said she seemed to cast a much narrower view of what official acts were than what the other majority justices said. For instance, she said that putting a fake slate of electors up would not be an official act. She seemed to, qualify the actions that a presidential candidate might take as being different than what a president would do. But I don't. It's a good question, Alex. I wish I had a better answer for you. I'm sorry I don't. Larry's in Brooklyn. Hello, Larry.
Yeah, hi, Frank. I won't mention John Gotti in this comment. Well, listen, I have 2 things to say. First of all, Supreme Court judges do not make policy. I don't know what this professor is talking about. If the only time they make public policy is if they're so partisan that they're not interpreting the Constitution.
I mean, Larry, that's just not true. It's just not true. I mean, the Citizens United decision, even if you agree with it, that made policy. You know, the Keogh versus New Canaan case on eminent domain, that made policy. They do make policy. The striking down the gun law case in New York, it made policy. It does. Keep asking questions.